I'm Steve Hindy. I'm co-founder and chairman of Brooklyn Brewery. Well, I was a journalist for the first 15 years of my working life, and 6 of those years were in the Middle East. I lived in Beirut and Cairo from 1979 to 1984, and I covered a lot of big stories: the Iran-Iraq War, the revolution in Iran, the hostage crisis, wars in Lebanon. I was sitting behind President Sadat of Egypt when he was killed in 1981. But the biggest impact on my life was meeting American diplomats who worked in Saudi Arabia, where they have Islamic law, no alcoholic beverages. They were avid homebrewers. You can imagine there's not a lot to do in Saudi Arabia, so being able to have a beer after work is pretty important. So these guys made their own beer at home, and I was amazed how good it was. And eventually, when I came back to the States, I started brewing at home myself. Yeah, my downstairs neighbor in Brooklyn was a young guy named Tom Potter. He was a banker with an MBA, always wanted to start his own business. And so I started trying to convince him that we should quit our jobs and start a brewery. It was not a great time for us to be quitting our jobs. We both had children, we both had mortgages, but eventually I convinced him that we could make money at this, and we started Brooklyn Brewery. There were probably about less than 30 small breweries in the U.S., mostly out on the West Coast. There were a few in the East Coast. But yeah, there weren't a lot of examples around to follow. So we kind of had to make it up as we went along. I think the most difficult part of the beer business is distribution and selling beer. You know, it's one thing to produce beer and to have a very nice glass of beer, but you have to sell it. You have to get paid for it. And at that time, the U.S. market was dominated by these big companies, and imported beers at that time, 1988, were only 2% of the U.S. market. And we felt we were making import quality beer and competing for that 2% of the market. But, you know, Brooklyn Lager was our first beer. It's an amber lager, it's dark, it's a little bit bitter compared to mainstream beers. And so a lot of people, customers, looked at us like we had two heads. It's, what are you thinking of? You know, why don't you make a beer like Budweiser or Heineken? And we said, no, we're determined to establish beer with flavor. And so we worked really hard. Luckily, there were some bars, restaurants, stores that understood what we were doing and supported us. Without that, I don't think we ever would have gotten anywhere. It did, but to be honest, I think it really wasn't until like 10 years into it that I felt like, okay, this may succeed. You know, we didn't really make any money, serious money, until like 15 years. It took a long time to build the brand. I mean, we sold more beer every year, but making a profit is very difficult for a startup, any kind of startup business, and particularly a startup in an industry dominated by giant companies. Well, it's interesting, you know, when we started early on, we were called microbreweries, and actually that term came from a computer programmer who worked for a homebrewing association in Colorado. And he said, you know, these small breweries are kind of like microprocessors. And he coined the term microbrewery. Years later, when some of the microbreweries started to grow to be pretty good size, we came up with the name craft brewery. And a craft brewery, the definition is created by our association, the Brewers Association. So we say to be a craft brewer, you have to be small. And we say small is fewer than 6 million barrels a year. 6 million barrels may sound like a lot, but keep in mind we're competing with a company, Anheuser-Busch InBev, that does 100 million barrels. So 6 million is small in that world. And you have to be independent. We define independence is you don't have any investment from a non-craft brewer greater than 25%. So in other words, you're an independent company. You control the company. And then the third criteria is kind of squishy. It started out saying you have to be innovative, or you have to be traditional. And then we added innovative to that. Of course, traditional and innovative are kind of contradictory. So I think of it more as being small and independent is how we define a craft brewer. And by the way, a microbrewery now is considered any brewery making fewer than 15,000 barrels a year. Oh yes, yeah, we're a craft brewery. This year, we'll probably produce around 300-some thousand barrels of beer, maybe 350,000 hectoliters of beer. So we're growing substantially, but still, we're nothing compared to the people we're competing with internationally and nationally. The secret of success is perseverance, is persistence. It's believing in what you're doing in spite of the results sometimes. We didn't make a profit for many years, but we sold more beer every year. And people believed in us, investors believed in us, so they kept us going. I bet a lot of business people over the last 30 years since I got into this, and I think any entrepreneur sitting here talking to you is going to say that persistence is a key element of any kind of venture, beer or otherwise. Yeah, I tell people who want to start a brewery to go for it. And obviously a lot of people are going for it. In America now, when we started in the mid-'80s, there were fewer than 50 brewing companies in America. Now there are more than 5,000, which is an unbelievable number. And there are 2,000 in planning. So I don't see this slowing down anytime soon. And by the way, in Holland, you have about 425, 450 breweries with 17 million people. You actually have more breweries per capita than we do in the United States. I think there are going to be all different models of business models for craft breweries. A lot of the ones that are starting up in the US now are very small, and they're very committed to selling beer mainly at their brewery to the public. So they have a tap room, and that's the way they have cash flow and keep going. There are some breweries, probably only fewer than 10, that are national, that sell all over the United States. And then, Brooklyn Brewery, I believe, will become an international craft brand. So we will sell nationally in the U.S. and we will sell around the world. So I think they're all different business models. And you know, people say to me, is 5,000 too many? And I don't think so, because you look historically before Prohibition in America. In the 1870s, there were 4,000 breweries in America. And America, the population was like 30 million or 40 million at that time. So I think there's plenty of room for growth. But back at that time, many of those breweries, like the small breweries today, were mainly selling at their location. And you know, that sustained a business for a small group of people. It's a different ballgame when you set out to sell your beer all over the United States or all around the world. It requires a different level of expertise in manufacturing and producing a beer that is durable. Yes, I did. There are some great Dutch beers. Last night I was in Rotterdam drinking Noort, which is produced by a terrific guy named Peter, and I had his black IPA and I had a wit beer, and they were both very clean and delicious beers. And here at Jopen, I had some of their beers this week too, and they're very nice beers. So that's, you know, very heartening to see high quality beer coming out of craft brewery in the Netherlands. You know, I'm amazed that we are selling Brooklyn beer all over the world because we have never done any advertising. It's all been word of mouth kind of marketing. And the export business that we do really began with amateur enthusiasts tasting our beer in New York City, coming to us and saying they wanted to sell the beer in Tokyo, in Stockholm, in Amsterdam, and Paris. And you know, this was very early in our business when we were struggling to sell it ourselves in Brooklyn. And I remember, I don't know if I said this to people, but what I was thinking was, are you crazy? Sell this in Tokyo? I'm having trouble selling it in Brooklyn. But we sent them beer that we told them they have to pay us first, and that's a terrible deal for them, but it was the only kind of deal we could make. And over the years, our brand caught on all around the world, and so it's a thrill for me to see people drinking my beer in Amsterdam. It's a thrill for me to see people drinking my beer in Brooklyn, but double thrill to see people drinking it in Amsterdam. I guess the appeal, it's a little taste of New York for people, and there's something about the name Brooklyn which is evokes a lot of images of kind of rough and tumble, urban kind of place, and I think that's part of it.
Dutch name.
And a Dutch name, of course, Brooklyn, and actually I went to the town of Brooklyn yesterday and got a nice picture on the Brooklyn Bridge. So I've always wanted to do that, and it was a thrill to be there. It's a nice little town too, with a lot of cool little restaurants and bars. The most important beer lesson I've learned is that selling beer is about people. It's not, you know, it's not about mass advertising. It's about people, and people build a brand. It doesn't happen through television or radio. At least a craft brand is built by people. And actually, if you go back to one of the CEOs of Anheuser-Busch, Gussie Busch, who came, he was like second generation of the Anheuser-Busch brewery. His motto was, "Our business is making friends." And I always thought that's a really good approach to selling beer. So what I've been doing here this week, talking to people, telling the story of the Brooklyn Brewery, is making friends for Brooklyn Brewery. And I immodestly say I've been pretty successful at doing that over the years. Dutch beer consumer, I think for beer drinkers, this is like a renaissance. I mean, this is a flowering of brewing, maybe the greatest flowering of the brewing industry in history. I don't think there's ever been a time in history where there were so many creative, innovative people starting breweries and creating beers and experimenting with beer and making high quality beer. I don't think it's ever happened before in history. So for a beer drinker, this is the best it's ever been.